All right, perfect. So, Dr. Din, thank you for that excellent explanation. It's good to see you all here. And for those of you that are still coming in, please do take your time. We're going to start off with, again, a little bit more of a detailed introduction for myself and what we will be going through for this seminar. So, this is a starter guide to university admissions in the United States. It's very well known. Everyone talks about it. You've even seen it in Hollywood movies. Now, this is meant to be a general guide, and I'm going to give you, this is going to be mostly an overview because there is really a lot of information to try and cram into this. Though I've done my best here to give you the specifics as well, a lot of practical tips. So feel free to screenshot certain things, and I will be giving a lot of specific resources as well throughout. Um, so you'll find them interspersed throughout the seminar and at the very end as well. And we also will have certain sections where you should be able to ask questions. So just as a little bit of an about me, and to deliver you some assurance here, I'm going to briefly tell you about my own admissions journey. So I personally applied to around 12 different universities in the United States during the admission schedule. Now that is definitely on the heavier side. That is something that we can talk about later. And I had up to that point experienced in my education, it's generally more work intensive than you might expect, especially in comparison to Australian admissions. And this is the bulk of what we're going to discuss today, what it takes to be accepted. And with this, I'm going to be going to see generally take into consideration, you want to consider your goals, what level of study that you have, though seeing that as you're here with Dr. Jin Education, I'm assuming that most of you are quite competent students. And perhaps some of you might be thinking of top level schools in the United States as your goals. Now, I was able to be accepted to the University of Chicago, Bowdoin, Yale, and Dartmouth. Some were accepted, some were deferrals, and did get to interview stage specifically with Yale. I wasn't accepted to Yale though, but I did get offers to Dartmouth. And ultimately, while I didn't end up attending due to scheduling and financial concerns, and also because I was also accepted to the University of Sydney and UNSW's double degree medical programs, which I judged to be better for me in the long run. I think it is proof of concept that the certain approach that I'm going to tell you about here does work, even at the highest level. And I'm currently attending the Bachelor of Science and Doctor of Medicine program at the University of Sydney, which is how I managed to become connected with the wonderful Dr. Jin Education and how I'm able to give you this seminar today. So moving on, we're going to have a bit of a general outline of what we're going to be talking about. So first, we're going to be taking a hopefully demystifying look at how US higher education in general is actually structured, particularly with regards to the type of institutions that actually exist. Now, generally, those are quite similar to those that you'll be used to in Australia, but there are some unique parts of the system. If you've been looking to include these, they may include words like liberal arts, and also the word college gets thrown around a lot in opposition to university. So we're going to clarify all of those. Next, we're going to take a look at how US admissions actually work, the timeline that you should adopt to be best prepared, and hopefully suffer less than I did because I did suffer a fair bit, and also the general philosophy that you should have towards admissions. And finally, in our third section, we're going to take a piece by piece look at how specifically you actually do all of these. And this is, so to speak, the true substance or the meat on the bone for this seminar. So hopefully that is, if I wanted you to get anything out of this seminar, it's what would be under heading 3, which is the specifics on how to build a compelling profile. And this is, by the way, not just a skill. Don't think of this as necessarily a skill that you only will be able to use for US admissions. It also works for pretty much any application anywhere where you find yourself in a very competitive environment. You have to promote yourself, and you maybe have to get into some place that has a very high degree of selectivity. So first, and So that's an overview. And now we're going to slow down and get into the details a little bit. So first off, just a couple of points for clarification. Generally, degrees in the United States tend to consist of a 4-year, excuse me, that's not quite what I meant to do. Degrees in the United States generally tend to consist of a 4-year, so it's almost always going to be 4 years, as opposed to the typical 3 years or more variety in New South Wales, and it's called the bachelor's. That, of course, plenty of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. This is essentially your undergraduate level studies, and it's again almost always going to be 4 years, unless you're undertaking some more specialized programs or in a particular university system, something analogous to maybe TAFE or a specific skills college, for example. And then you have your bachelor's degree, which is 4 years. And then you usually apply again. And this, of course, you'll be familiar with. I'm just going through it so that I'm sure that everyone's on the same page. You have your master's degree, which you can apply to again. A lot of people actually, if they want to get a foothold in the US, what they end up doing is their bachelor's degree, they don't necessarily, even if they don't get into a top level school, they still end up attending. They do very well in the bachelor's level, so the undergraduate degree, and then for their master's or postgrad, because now that you have the connections and you've proven yourself, it's generally much easier to get into a highly selective university. That is also a pathway that is possible. And then, of course, you have your doctorate, and the masters and doctorates differ very heavily depending on which specific area that you're going into. Now, this is, I think, one of the most important categorizations that we're going to go over today. And it's one that we're going to come back to continually for multiple reasons, not least practical, but also conceptual. And that's going to be clarified quite soon. So in the United States, there are 4 main types of institutions that you have to be familiar with, and they're actually quite different. And of course, there's a profusion of exceptions and special cases, but for the most part, you can categorize them into these 4 classes. So the most prestigious institutions, the ones that are most well known, these are the ones that your grandparents have heard about, that almost always people are going to think of when they think of US universities. These are your private universities. These are funded by their students and alumni, which is a very large part of private institutions and institutions in the US in general, by the way, is alumni school relationships are very, very, very strong. And of course, your private institutions include the famous Ivy League, right? MIT, though MIT is technically not an Ivy, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, all of these are private schools. Most of the highly selective institutions in the US that you will have heard about, these are going to be private institutions. Now, a major point about private institutions is that they are essentially, and more openly, though, they're essentially going to be business driven. People may also say about certain places, especially, for example, criticism that have been labeled against UCID, that UCID is also run a bit too much like a for-profit business. Well, in the United States, private institutions are very open about the fact that they are business driven. That has a lot of implications for when you're trying to apply to them, but for now, that's just something to keep in mind, that private institutions, they have to make money from their students. That also does mean that they tend to be quite expensive. But on the other hand, it does mean that they have the power to give financial aid to students that are not from the United States, to American students as well. And they also tend to be, but not always, more selective than the other. Now, liberal arts is going to be a category that's very, very new to quite a lot of you. In fact, despite my attending an American high school, until I started the American admissions cycle, my parents had never even heard of liberal arts. So liberal arts colleges include colleges such as Amherst or Bowdoin or Pomona. These are generally not quite as well known, but they're still actually really, really, really highly ranked. In fact, they have Amherst has an admissions rate that's quite comparable to the top 20 in the United States. And a lot of them actually do rank directly in the top 20 or the top 25. Now, they generally refer to colleges that are broader in educational scope. That's where the word liberal comes from, by the way. It's not political affiliation. It's just referring to the type of degree or type of study that you'll be doing. The core degree generally is wider, but not necessarily, and it's, by the way, it's not necessarily in the arts. A lot of liberal arts degrees, somewhat paradoxically, at least according to the name, are in STEM. And they also don't have a postgraduate stage. So this is where I want to make the distinction between undergraduate and postgraduate. Undergraduate is called college. Harvard has Harvard College and Harvard University. This causes a lot of confusion. Harvard College is the undergraduate. That's where high school graduates will go to. That's where, if you are right now in year 11, you hopefully before year 12, because if you're in year 12 and just starting to apply, it might be difficult to do that without a gap year. That's where you'll be applying to, is colleges. University, yes, it refers to both undergraduate and postgrad, but it generally refers to the wider institution, including doctorate, master's, and PhD students and researchers. Liberal arts colleges don't have a postgraduate. They're entirely composed of undergraduate students. They also tend to be much smaller in terms of class size. That's not a bad thing. In fact, a lot of people consider that a very, very good thing, because it means it's much easier to forge direct connections with your professors and your classmates, so on and so forth. But we're going to come back to that. Like pretty much everything that we are right now is set up. We're going to come back to that a bit later. Then, of course, you have what you might be most familiar with conceptually is the state and your public institutions. Now, these are essentially public colleges. Because the United States is so large and diverse, the specific nature tends to vary from region to region. But however, you generally can still find pretty highly prestigious and excellent quality education here. The biggest downside, obviously, first off, is that, well, they tend to be much larger and not quite as well known outside of the US. And secondly, while the fees do tend to be lower for within state or within nation students, they're not quite as kind to internationals, but they are still a potential option. And lastly, you have the UC systems colleges. So UC stands for University of California. There are currently, if I recall correctly, 9 UC colleges that are registered. All of them are obviously in California, and they are public funded research universities. Now, they work a little differently from the rest of the nation. They have their own application system or application platform, and they form this little specific group, sort of analogous to the Ivies and almost as prestigious, by the way. In fact, a lot of the University of California institutions are some of the best in the world. They're often referred to colloquially as the public Ivies. Now, these include, of course, the one pictured here, which is the University of California, Berkeley, as well as UC Santa Barbara and UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. Now, there's a lot of individual variation, as you can see, between individual institutes in the United States. But in general, and just to come back and make a quick comparison of size to help you get an idea of what we're dealing with, private universities tend to be smaller. So think less than 30,000 students in total, like the entire school has less than 30,000 students. Liberal arts colleges tend to be even smaller, like much smaller. Public schools tend to be very large, and UC schools are also very large. In fact, UCLA has over 30,000 undergraduates alone. Now, which is sort of similar to what you see with the University of Sydney and UNSW. They are also very, very large institutions. That doesn't diminish, I think, in the least from the prestige or opportunities that you get here. But that's something to consider when you think about what sort of environment you want to be in. So which universities you choose to apply to depends on your needs, ambition, and ability. It's a combination of all of those. So here is a roadmap. Here is a general roadmap of how you would apply to colleges in the United States. And you can go as intensively into this as you like. For example, One person I know applied to exactly one school that they wanted to get into it, and they ended up getting in. Though, please don't do that unless you are very confident in your backup options in the future, because that's genuinely seen as not a very wise tactic. But that's also an option if you're completely comfortable with applying elsewhere, if you do end up getting rejected. Others like me spent a lot of time in year 11 to really get invested. So firstly, and this is, of course, what the entire process will look like and entail. Firstly, you want to research where to apply and sort of narrow down your search, because as the previous slide would have sort of started to give you an idea, there's a lot of variety in the type of institution that you can apply to. Now, we'll discuss later why selecting the right uni for you is more important than you might think, and why I keep emphasizing it. But a lot of students sort of come in with the mindset that, well, if it's prestigious and it ranks well and it's famous, then of course I'll be happy going there and I should try applying. This is not the best idea for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a lot of effort. And secondly, if you're not a good fit for the university, not only will you eventually not notice, but the admissions officers will also notice when they start evaluating your profile, which is something we'll go into in a lot more detail later. But that is why research is important. Stage 2 is your exams. So that would be for those of you completing the HSC. Of course, it would be the HSC, though if you do want to apply to the US and do it very competitively, I would strongly encourage you to consider taking the SAT. Especially for those of you with a HSC education, the SAT is quite approachable in my humble opinion. It's very trainable and quite feasible to get a very, very competitive score in the SAT. And of course, you also want to gather your letters and start researching scholarships. Stage 4 is essays, which is another region of the application process to the United States that a lot of you might find rather foreign, like, especially admissions essays. There's a huge variety of admissions essays and what you can do. And there's a sort of bewildering amount of individual freedom that you can express there as well. And in stage 5, we get to assemble everything, and then you complete your application. And we're going to have come in with specific dates for those of you that are interested as well later. Okay, just one moment, as I'm not seeing the timer on my screen. There we go. Okay, that was rather worrying for me because I need to make sure that I don't go over time. Okay, so first, we need to understand how applications in general are assessed. Now, some understanding of this, some of you already have some understanding of it or have heard of it in some capacity or other. And admissions, unlike a lot of other places in the world, in the United States is highly holistic. That's the word that we use. In other words, admissions officers will be looking to consider you as a whole rather than through your demographic numbers or your ATAR mark or even your SAT score. So if we take a look at this pie chart, you'll notice that, so holistic assessment, which is essentially admissions officers trying to figure out, is this student right for this university and will they do well for us? So around 40% of your profile will be academics. It will be things like, well, your general grades or the marks that you got in your high school, and especially your expected marks as well, because when you apply to the US system, you often do it before having fully gotten back your year 12 marks. That combined with the SAT and also any other out of school studies that you might choose to do, for example, the IB. The IB is quite common in Australia as well. And in the US, of course, AP programs as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. Then around a quarter of it, arguably more actually, a lot of people argue for more, like 30%, is going to be extracurriculars and leadership. This is, again, quite a new concept to a lot of you, especially. So we sort of evaluate what you did outside of school as well, just to make sure, just not necessarily to make sure, but just to use it as an opportunity to get to know the student better. How do they spend their time? What do they do when they're not studying, right? And does that line up with what they sort of say that they want to do in university? And of course, the 25% here is your writing. That's going to be, well, I've labeled it Common App here because that is the most widely used platform for you to submit all of your essays, your writing, your responses in one place, and we're going to go over all of this for the rest of this seminar in a lot more detail. So that is holistic assessment. And of course, we also have interviews, but interviews, I'm not going to spend quite as much time on because they generally are quite similar across different education systems. And for admissions interviews, I will give some tips and also feel free to ask any questions, but they are generally seen as somewhat less important for the application. The vast majority of people focus almost exclusively on academics, extracurriculars, and your writing. So firstly, I want to introduce you to the Common App. Now, this is similar to the Australian UAC, and this is the platform through which you'll be submitting the majority of your applications. It's, again, essentially a platform for applying to universities. Almost all universities in almost all states of the US will be using this application format with a couple exceptions. The biggest exception is, as I mentioned before, the UC systems. Now, because the University of California systems, they have their own platform, which you can search up and take a look at for yourself, maybe out of interest. And there are always certain universities that choose not to use the Common App, such as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So MIT requires you to apply to them directly through their own website. Now, when we describe Common App specifically, we're usually talking about the essays that you'll end up writing on it. But there's a lot of other things that goes into it. It's essentially a hub for everything that you will end up submitting in your application. Now, some of these include demographic questions. So you notice there's a section here on family. Now, because this policy called affirmative action will no longer be significant, so your background and your demographics don't matter as much as they used to. So this is something that people generally recommend that you just fill in honestly and not worry too much about, as it probably won't affect your admissions chances that much. Now, there are always those sort of rumors and memes going around of filling racial quotas and matters of that sort, but generally you don't need to be too concerned with them. Now, this is also where you submit your SAT scores and any other scores you have. So that's under testing. And of course, your educational record here. And you also have a section here for financial aid applications, which determines your eligibility for financial aid, which we'll talk about later. And most importantly, of course, this is where you have all of your writing. This is where you submit all of your essays. And something to keep in mind in general about the Common App is that because it's so general, after all, it has to be applicable to an incredibly diverse set of universities and also a diverse set of people that are applying to it. So this means that there's plenty of extra space for you to sort of explain yourself. For example, when I applied, there was a section for me to explain to the admissions officers how COVID might have impacted my academic record. Not exactly as an excuse, but it just so that I could let them know. And it helped explain the gap in my activities during lockdown. So they do everything that they can to be inclusive of everyone, even international students and students that have not completed the SAT. Even though I did attend an American high school, the circumstances for my education were often quite unique. And I never felt that I was at a disadvantage because of that, just because there was a lot of space to explain yourself. In fact, they have around a 650 word section just for you to freestyle if you want to, of course, and explain yourself further. So that is the Common App in a nutshell. And now we're going to look again at this donut chart, pie chart, donut chart, I guess, and look at the individual sections specifically. So in terms of academics, the most important one, well, arguably, though there's a lot of debate about that actually. Our first component, we have the SAT. So as an introduction to the SAT, so the SAT is the primary entrance exam used by most colleges and universities in the United States in order to make academic decisions. It also has an impressively high degree of applicability to other institutions around the world. It is generally quite well recognized and understood, even outside of the US. In fact, I was able to apply to the University of Sydney using specifically the double degree medical program using my SAT score, which was quite competitive. And it's widely accepted in almost all institutions. Now, there is a competitor to the SAT, which some of you who have researched American admissions before might have heard of, which is called the ACT, which is also widely accepted, but it's not used as much internationally. So for Australian students, I don't recommend it quite as much. There's just a lot more information out there, more communities, and more opportunities for the SAT from my experience. Just know that, just as a fun fact, the SAT is generally used in the East and West Coasts and in the big cities a lot more, while the ACT is more commonly used in the Midwest and the rural regions of America. So how does the SAT actually work? Well, first off, some basic facts to get us started. The total score is a possible 1600. The minimum score is 400, and the average score usually hovers, as you can see, at around a total of 1000 to 1100. I think last year, though this might be outdated, the average score was something around 1060. Now, as you'll come to understand as we continue to discuss things, the SAT is far from the only factor, nor is it even arguably the biggest factor when it comes to university admissions. It is not quite the same as the Gaokao, for example, or the Australian ATAR in that regard. You get all these blogs about, as soon as year 12 ATARs wrapped up, I began seeing a lot of articles in my newsfeed, such as, how your ATAR does not determine the outcome of your life. Now, that may be true. That's even more true for the SAT, but it is by far the most immediate metric, along with your high school grades, that colleges can judge you by. And a high SAT score will help you a lot towards making your application more competitive. Now, a lot of institutions actually do go test optional, especially recently in the name of equity, because it is a truth that more economically advantaged regions generally tend to have much higher, not much higher, but significantly higher SAT score averages. But it is still an option. And if you are able to get a strong score and you want to apply to a highly competitive institute, I do still strongly recommend it. So the total 1600, as you might have noticed, and some of you might already know this, is composed of two sections, mathematics and reading, each being worth up to 800 points in total. So here's a typical score breakdown of the SAT. And something to note, by the way, about this graph is that it is true for local students and international students as well, even students whose first language not necessarily is English. This is because the SAT exam is curved. It is curved by region. The process by which it is done is a little less than transparent at times, but in general, you'll get a raw score, and the final score that you get depends heavily on which percentile score you landed on, rather than your raw mark. So even if the format of the SAT changes, like it did recently, actually, the general likelihood and how difficult it is to get a certain score will remain roughly unchanged as they are able to make it. Now, so here we can see you get your total score here, and they will also give you breakdowns of your percentiles. And again, your scores come out of a 200 to 800, so 200 minimum, 800 maximum in English. So English composed of two smaller sections, and your mathematics score, right? So the biggest question that always arises when we start discussing admissions and exam scores specifically is, what score do I need to get into the school that I want to? Well, there's no direct answer to that. And especially because US admissions is holistic, there isn't exactly a specific score that's guaranteed to get you in or is very likely to get you in, nor does that mean that a very low score means that you have no chance. It means that you'll have a much harder time and you'll have to have something very compelling otherwise about your profile, but it doesn't eliminate your chances completely. However, you can still find that out. The best way to do that is by searching your school specifically that you want to look at, For example, let's say, why not Harvard? You can search up Harvard undergraduate average SAT score, which we actually have right here. So the specifically for the Ivy League, because that's what a lot of people are most interested in. So the middle 50 percentiles for you to compare Ivy League SAT scores. So we have Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, UPenn, and Yale. And you'll notice that the vast majority of them, the lowest percentile is roughly at around 1400, and the highest percentile is roughly at around 1560 or 1570, right? So that's sort of the score that you should be generally aiming at if you want to get into these sort of institutions. Now, quick caveat here is that these are super, super competitive schools. You don't necessarily have to get these scores to attend a school in the United States. A general rule of thumb is that if you manage to get 1300 and above, you can begin looking at more competitive schools ranked within top 50 in the nation, though I again encourage you not to limit yourself. There's a lot more that goes into a successful application than your SAT. 1400 and above, which is, in my opinion, if you study for it correctly, is very highly achievable, particularly if you have strong foundations, which since you are here, I imagine that many of you have. I actually helped manage to teach a student, and I saw his SAT score rise from around 1300, which is very, very good, but still not quite what he wanted, to around 1550, which is enough pretty much to be satisfied to try applying to even the most selective schools in the world. Now, as for the content, it's almost it's surprisingly content light. In fact, it used to be 3 hours, and now with the digital SAT, it's actually even shorter. The reason for that is that the SAT has to be standardized to all education systems in the US and the world. In other words, despite the huge variety of education systems that are within the nation, the SAT sort of has to be doable for all of them. So for that reason, the subjects that are tested in it are only two: math and reading, and writing and language. So essentially math and English, right? Now, as for the mathematics, it's relatively basic, and sort of most people who have completed HSC Maths Year 11 should expect to be able to complete the SAT mathematics section with good marks, and very good marks with some practice. For example, by far the most complex concept that you'll come across in the SAT is going to be inscriptions in circles, and pretty much every problem in the math section you should be able to solve if you have the correct method in under 20 seconds. So the mathematics is not difficult at all, though the difficulty does lie in having to be very fast and precise. Now, the SAT English and writing is much more specific, and you do have to study for it specifically if you want to optimize your score. Now, English in general in the SAT emphasizes heavily comprehension and mastery of the language. So they'll test you on your ability to arrange a sentence to maximize clarity of expression. Now, the reason for that is that these institutions that consider these the most important skills for university. In effect, the ability to digest large amounts of information quickly, now, and then distill it down to understand quickly. The keyword is quickly, because you will be under time pressure. Understand the crux of what is being said, and then use that information to answer the questions that are thrown at you. For example, you'll have questions like, the author's argument is best summarized as ... or the stance that the speaker takes in the passage is best described as ... Also questions regarding the meanings of words in context, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, just as a clarification, now the SAT is digital. In other words, it is tested at a facility. You still can't test it at home, but you do have to go to a facility, but it is digital. So it consists of 4 modules, and you will have 98 questions, and the duration is going to be 2 hours and 14 minutes. Nothing else about the content or the scoring system has changed. But the reading and writing does come first, and you have these different modules, and now the SAT, in the name of equity, is adaptive. In other words, if you do really well in the first module, then module 2 becomes a little bit more difficult to challenge you a bit more. Now, that isn't exactly punishing you for doing well on the SAT, but it is something that you have to keep in mind. And I'm giving you this information just so you have an idea of what the SAT looks like specifically. It's only 2 subjects, and relatively, it's quite short compared to a lot of other admissions examinations in different nations. And in my opinion, again, I really do encourage all of you who are thinking about it that it is very doable to study for. I myself actually completely self-studied for the SAT. I did not attend any did not attend any intensives or anything like that, though for certain people they are invaluable. So I don't think that that's necessarily useless, but it is very doable with the correct sort of coaching and practice. So for general preparation, and this is a couple of resources that you can use to find out more about it or to study for it specifically. Khan Academy, which many of you I'm sure are at least somewhat familiar with, partnered actually with College Board, which is the company that the SAT is issued under. And they have official SAT practice. And you have certain books as well, which I just want to personally recommend as being very useful to prepare for the SAT. And with these and with the correct sort of coaching and direction and a correct understanding of the examination, it is a very doable exam, even without a terrible amount of effort. So that is one of the larger components of your exam. It's the one that a lot of people are familiar with as well, which is your academics, specifically your entry exam scores. So now we're going to move on to another key component of admissions in terms of academics. So we have the AP, which is an abbreviation for Advanced Placement, and IB programs. So AP is an education standard in the United States where you essentially take a standardized college course. So it's been standardized, and you take it in years 9, 10, 11, or 12, and you just take it in advance, essentially. And it's also run by College Board. So the Acorn logo here, which you will also have seen for back here, I think, if I can find it, this Acorn logo here is College Board. College Board is the company that runs the SAT and that runs AP and a lot of other aspects of the admissions system, in fact, which is a bit of a quirk about American education, by the way, that just out of interest, this is not too important, but just to sort of give you an understanding, is that a lot of it is profit-driven and company-driven. So College Board specifically competes with other institutions, which is why they're motivated to not make things terribly difficult, but still very useful for competitive institutions. So now it was created in the 1950s as response to a widening gap between secondary school, so high school, and college. So it sort of helps you bridge the gap. And of course, the IB program, which you will be much more familiar with. So now you can take either of these. For you students in Australia, the IB will be much more practical to do. But the point of this is that if you take these courses in high school, first off, that is actually a pretty key part of admissions. It's a big part of your profile, actually, which courses you specifically took. And also, upon admission, some colleges will actually completely waive general education requirements for students who have completed the either AP courses or IB courses. For example, you can skip a bunch of intro classes. Now, this obviously would be a huge saving on both finances and time. Now, that's definitely something to consider, but the more significant part of this is its impact on admissions. And just in the middle, we have the New South Wales HSC. Now, because of its focus on Australia specifically, the New South Wales HSC doesn't have quite the degree of global recognition of the AP or IB diploma. So unfortunately, even if you do end up doing, for example, Extension 2 mathematics, that won't allow you to skip intro-level college courses in the United States if you do end up taking classes there. But you can absolutely explain that that is a far more challenging course and that you're very competent in mathematics if you did well in it, of course, and give them admissions officers a general understanding of it. But it doesn't have quite as much of a direct impact on your admissions as the IB or the AP programs do. So if it is possible, I do recommend perhaps considering at least a couple of maybe IB programs. AP programs you can also take online. And for those of you that are quite competent in the HSC, AP programs should be actually very, very straightforward to do because their content is, and I'm speaking from experience here, quite closely aligned to the HSC, especially chemistry and calculus. They are very, very similar. If you've completed HSC chemistry or doing HSC chemistry or well, there's not a specific calculus program, but mathematics advanced even, then you'll be quite comfortable taking these programs online. Now, but as I said, the biggest impact that these will have is not necessarily on your, once you get to college, you want to get there first. So the biggest impact is on your admissions itself. So colleges actually tend to favor students who've taken a few harder classes instead of a lot of easier classes. Now, according to a survey in 2017, 52% of schools ranked strength of curriculum, in other words, how difficult were the programs that you'd completed, as considerably important in admissions. So if it is possible for you, and for the majority of the audience, I don't exactly know what year you're in, but if it is possible, I would strongly recommend, if you want to competitively apply for very prestigious institutions in the United States, consider opting for harder classes, not just because they'll challenge you to grow intellectually and they're generally a strongly recommended experience if you're a strong student to begin with, but because it'll reflect very favorably on your admissions. Now, most colleges say in a transcript that shows a student, say that a transcript that has shown a student that has taken increasingly demanding classes is much more important than a transcript with a very high average mark. A survey in 2018 reported that 77% of schools believe that grades in college prep courses are considerably important. Now, what's college prep? That's your IB, your AP, or slightly less directly applicable, but still definitely doable, is your extension classes, right? So those are very considerably important factors in the admissions process. So even if, and it doesn't matter quite as much with the HSC because the marks are curved, right? But definitely opt for harder classes in general. Now, AP, just to explain a little bit more about AP classes. Now, you can take them online. That is the taking of the course. And you can apply for this to show up in your transcript, or you can even attach it separately as a certificate that you've completed an AP course. What you can then do is actually apply to take a standard AP exam. So an examination in that subject area that is administered by College Board themselves. And if you do that, that is obviously even more of a proof that you have mastered the subject, but it is also what you can use to directly get college credit. So definitely research that, though opportunities in Australia for the AP program aren't quite as common. So again, I recommend IB over AP. There are even third-party options that you can do sort of outside of school to show your interest. For example, because I applied into medicine specifically, I took an edX course in biochemistry when I was in year 11. So biochemistry, I took from this platform. If you've not heard of it before, it's actually founded, I think if I recall correctly, by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they essentially have a bunch of very prestigious institutions open up their courses for free, open access on edX, and you can actually study them. And you can pay a little bit to actually take an exam and also get a certificate to show that you've taken that college level course. So that is also something that you can consider. At the very least, I strongly recommend that you go and to give it a look because there's a lot of opportunities there. They have everything from biochemistry to computer science to business management to finance. So there's a lot of options there as well. So that is sort of covers the academics portion of what you will be looking at when you apply. So now the next largest component for your application is going to be your essays. This is a very big part. So we're going to jump right from academics here over to Common App and essays. Now, this is by far, I would say, along with extracurriculars, the more foreign part of the application process to the United States. Now, this consists of you'll be doing a lot of writing, essentially. So what you will need to apply to the majority of the US institutions is you'll need a personal essay, also referred to as the Common App essay, though there are other application systems as well. But all of them will incorporate some form of a personal essay. They will also then have a college-specific writing supplement. So this is something that the college will individually demand, and we're going to talk about that at length in just a moment. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, you even have space for additional information where you can feel free to explain your own situation for an additional around 650 words, though that does vary from system to system. And just as a general note on the philosophy that you want to have here, modesty doesn't pay off here. You want to promote yourself. Now, this might be a slight cultural difference. America in general, I find, views quite naturally the sort of what might be seen even as boastful, especially my cultural background is Korean, and I often felt rather uncomfortable doing this, but you have to allow yourself to sort of shine. That doesn't mean to come off as obnoxious or self-obsessed in your writings, but in general, don't hold back about your own achievements. Definitely promote yourself. That's what you're trying to do with this essay, right? Using your own judgment, of course, to, again, not come off as obnoxious or self-obsessed, right? So let's take an individual look now at each of these components and what you'll need for them, right? So again, just to summarize and get us back on track, we just looked at academics. To sum them up quickly, we have the SAT, then we have your high school marks, of course. And in addition to those, you can do extra programs in the AP, though that's probably not going to be as feasible for most of you. Though definitely look into options if you can, because that's really, really good. And they're very widely recognized, by the way. Or the IB systems, or even third-party systems and certificates, anything to supplement to your education. So now, again, we're going to look at essays. So let's look at the personal essay in particular. Now, for Common App, and you'll see a bunch of prompts on the slides. So firstly, we have the personal essay. Now, these are the prompts that you'll be faced with. So if we take a look, you have things like, some students have a background, identity, interest, or talent that is so meaningful, they believe their application would be incomplete without it. Now, if that sounds like you, please share your story, right? That's one of the prompts. Or maybe reflect on a time when you questioned or challenged a belief or idea. What prompted your thinking and what was the outcome? So you have these prompts, which you can choose from, or you can just share whatever essay format that you like. Share an essay on any topic of your choice. It can be one you've already written, one that responds to a different prompt, or one of your own design, right? Now, the purpose of a personal essay, and by the way, you do need to distinguish this a little bit from the British personal statement. Now, colleges want the personal essay to be a way to get to know you, not necessarily to gauge your general academic or literary skill. This is not a writing test. If it was, it would be very unfair because there are a lot of students who are very strong in STEM and mathematics that are not nearly as interested in writing a very beautifully written, eloquent, poetic essay, right? But colleges want this to get to know you as a person, right? So of course, academic skill and just being able to express yourself articulately is a generally super useful skill and is a major factor. So the personal essay is your chance to build a profile. It's now building a profile. I've mentioned this multiple times before. It's a recurring theme across these sections. So you want to build a profile towards what you think the colleges will see as something that they want to have attending their institution. That's the idea. And I'm going to go back to this again. That's the idea of the holistic assessment, right? You want to sort of build a profile that will be appealing to the specific institutions that you will end up attending. So that's the personal essay. Now, let's get a little bit more into the specifics. And you can take this either very specifically as tips if you do want to directly start applying and writing, or you can also sort of take it as a brief look. So for those of you that are not quite as worried about applying yet, you can sort of take it as a brief look through of what writing a personal essay might look like. So there are two basic structural approaches, and there are way, way, way more. There's so much variation to what you can do, but generally for students who sort of want to figure out what they want to write about, I recommend, and a lot of experts recommend, these two structures that you can sort of go with. And of course, these two exist a bit on a continuum. Like it can be part montage and part narrative, but as and I've sort of already spoiled it for myself, we have either the montage or the narrative. And which structural approach you choose depends on your answer to this question above. Do you feel like you faced significant challenges in your life, and do you want to write about them? If you have faced significant challenges and you would like to write about them, and you feel that that would be an appealing part of a story to help college admissions officers get to know you, then you choose the narrative. If not, or you'd rather write about something else, I would highly suggest that you choose the montage. So to explain each format a little bit, narrative revolves around a character or characters. For a college essay, that's you. Now, working to overcome certain challenges, learning, growing, and gaining insight. For a typical college essay using narrative structure, you'd focus the word count roughly equally on challenges you faced, what you did about them, and what you learned, right? Now, caveat that these can sort of be interwoven and of course balanced based on your own personal judgment, right? Now, a montage, if you don't know what the word means already, is a series of thematically connected things, often images. Now, you've likely seen montages a lot of times on everything from film to even Instagram Reels or TikToks. Like for example, in a rom-com, here's the couple meeting and dating and falling in love. So like in sequence, you would see those quite quickly. Or in action movies, the training montage, like in Rocky, right? So a few vivid images collected to tell a larger story. In a college essay, you could build a montage by using a thematic thread to write about maybe five different sets of shoes that connect to different sides of who you are and what you value. Maybe one of them you use for sport, or maybe one of them is your interest in fashion design, or maybe one of them is just full covered so you can use it in the lab, right? Or different but connected things that you love and know a lot about, for example, animals or maybe even games, right? So first montage. Now, also, depending on what you want to write about, you can sort of choose one of these two structures. Now, a narrative essay is more likely to stand out if it contains difficult or compelling challenges and actual insight that you can gain from them. In other words, things that you overcame that people will hear about and go, wow, that's actually really impressive or interesting, and that you can look at and go, I learned a lot from this, and my insight might even be valuable. Now, of course, again, this can exist on a spectrum. Now, montages, on the other hand, I think they generally tend to work better if you're writing about something that is very flexible or unique, right? For example, flexible as in that it can apply to a lot of different ideas, or it has a lot of different interconnected ideas. Now, to ground this, because this is a very abstract thing that we're talking about, let's ground this in a bit of an example, because I'm sure that you can imagine a narrative essay quite easily. A montage essay, a very common type of montage essay, in fact, is the object montage essay. Now, this you might have even heard about. It's a very, very well-known essay format. And what it is essentially is that it often will have the student write about an object that they fixate on. And then they will talk about how their life they might even maybe describe their life from the perspective of that object at different points in their life, right? Or how the object stayed the same, but they evolved around it, and how in that context, the object sort of grounds the sort of montage or the essay, right? One of the, for example, a very typical example might be, and there's a reason why this is typical, is because it works. It is often very unique because you can write about a lot of very unique things. Students have written about Rubik's cubes, Rubik's cubes, or even one friend who got admitted to Harvard, actually. He was my co-student at the University of Sydney for a while, and then he actually dropped out because he had gotten into Harvard, and he decided that that would be better to attend than here. In Sydney, is that he wrote about a little compass. He wrote about a little gyroscopic compass that he had received when he was a child from his grandmother. And he sort of wove a story of how his love for writing and its description sort of evolved around it, because his strong point for that friend is that he is a writer. He is a published poet, and that's what he went to Harvard for. And sort of he used a very compelling metaphor of how the compass always pointed in the same direction, and it helped orient him in his tumultuous life because he moved around as he was growing up. So that's maybe an example of what a montage essay might be, right? Now, a couple more points just to give you a bit more understanding of what a personal essay might want to be. So these are questions that you want to ask yourself, and these are a lot. But again, I'm just trying to give you the best idea or general picture possible. Now, you want your essay to contain core values, right? Showing who you are through what value. You also want it to contain some amount of vulnerability to help a reader feel connected to you. Now, quick caveat here, you don't want to trauma dump. Certain students I have seen do this. They sort of trauma dump in their essay, or the infamous essay format is the dead grandparent one, excuse me, but it is, they talk about the death of a family member or often a loved one, and how it changed their perspective on the world, or how maybe, for example, if you are trying to get into medicine, how that made them interested in medicine. The problem with this is, first off, it's a lot more common than you might think. And second, it sort of is a bit too much emotional weight, and you really don't need to be doing that to your admissions officer. And often the emotional weight that comes with it is too forced. It sort of comes from the event itself rather than your writing. And they don't want to hear about what happened to you necessarily. They want to hear about you and what insights you bring, right? And of course, you want your essay to contain, as I said, insight and craft as well. So clear structure, refined language, and intentional choices. And definitely feel free to be individually expressive in your personal essays if you're writing them. And to test what values are coming through, you can read your essay aloud to someone who knows you and ask, now, which values are clearly coming through in the essay? And which could be kind of there, but could be coming through better? And which could be coming through and were opportunities missed? And of course, we have also some ways to test whether you're being sufficiently vulnerable. Though, of course, this will depend heavily on what you decide to write about in your essay in general. I personally, for the application process, wrote about how I moved between a lot of different cultures, because I did do that as I was growing up, and how that shaped my perspective of the worldview, and how one thing remained constant throughout that, which was that because I did a lot of volunteer work, I always wanted to try and do better for people in the most practical way possible. And that sort of shaped my interest in medicine. That is, by the way, not the optimal format for an essay. In fact, if you read blogs and expert blogs and admissions officers and what they've written about this, they often don't tell you to not not cite helping people as a reason that you want to do medicine. But that goes to show that sometimes if you're sincere enough, you can break the mold and you make it work. But my example, in terms of essays, I think is not the best one that it could have been. So that's the personal essay. You want to deliver a sort of image of yourself to the admissions team that they will understand and that will be hopefully attractive to them, right? Now, in addition to the personal essay, you also want a writing supplement. So you will need writing supplements for each college you apply to. The less selective colleges generally often will simply accept your primary personal essay, and they won't ask for anything else. But especially with more selective colleges, they will ask for supplemental essays. And some of these are actually really fun too. I personally quite enjoyed writing a lot of these. The most famous of these actually is the University of Chicago, so which is an Ivy. Um, Not quite, but it practically is. Now, for example, essay option 1 here, they're known for these very unique, fun prompts. For example, one option here says exponents and square roots, pencils and erasers. Name two things that undo each other and explain why both are necessary in around 500 words. Or essay option 2, where have all the flowers gone? Pete Seeger, pick a question from a song or lyric and give it your best answer. So these are sort of opportunities for you to further express your creativity, maybe your wit, or just your sort of how you tend to express yourself. What prompt you choose and how you answer it gives a lot of information as well, right? And in addition to that, in the supplemental section, you will, if it's a selective school, almost always, practically always, it's almost a guarantee, you'll almost always have a why us essay. Now, for example, this is the one that you are confronted with when you add Dartmouth College to your Common App and you go to the supplemental writing section. This is required of all applicants in 100 words or fewer, which is not a lot, by the way. It asks you, as you seek admission to Dartmouth's class of 2028, what aspects of the college's academic program, community, and/or campus environment attract your interest? In short, why Dartmouth? And this leads us into a major component of your supplemental essays, which is the why us essay. So colleges in general want to admit students who will enroll to protect their yield. So this, again, sort of goes back to the idea that a lot of private institutions in the United States are run like businesses. Now, they want to protect their yield percentage. So yield is the number of applicants that the college sends out offers to, and the percentage of students who actually attend out of all of the people that receive offers. And obviously for very selective schools, such as the Ivies, yield percentage is typically very high, while much, much lower. So colleges want to sort of protect that figure and keep the yield percentage as high as possible. So that's one major reason why colleges actually want students to write the why us. They want to be as sure as possible that if I do send this student my offer, they will probably, most likely, end up actually attending. Now, they also ask this because they want their students to thrive and excel and do well on their campus. And so they ask this why us question to sort of see whether you're truly interested in the school and whether it's the right place for you. Now, now Dartmouth asks like that. Northwestern makes it even more specific. Help us understand what aspects of Northwestern appeal most to you and how you'll make use of the specific resources and opportunities here. And this is a list of just a couple of the colleges that require students to write the Why Us essay. And you may recognize a lot of names here. You have Duke, Columbia, Cornell, the list goes on. Now, we're going to talk rather briefly about how exactly you would write a Why Us essay. So what you don't want to do is, and this is the biggest one that you want to avoid at all costs, is be general. For example, let's take an example for Tufts. Maybe a student might write, I'm applying to Tufts, which is a bit of a funny name. That's sort of why I chose it. But because of its low student, Tufts is a very highly selective liberal arts college, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States, by the way. I'm applying to Tufts because of its low student to faculty ratio, the strong math department, and its prime location in Medford, just a hop away from Boston. When I visited campus, the school already felt like home. Now, there's a multitude of things wrong here, but firstly, the students cited generic aspects of the school: location, weather size, and training. You don't want to do that. That means pretty much for any selective institution, you will be writing this sort of essay to. You should never tell them, I'm applying to, say, I'm applying to Yale because it is prestigious and highly selective and I like the challenge. No, don't do that. A lot of other schools are highly selective and anyone could have said that, right? Secondly, you don't want to use empty emotional appeals such as it already felt like home or how much the school means to you personally. Those generally don't work too well. Third, you want to describe your goals and interests. You don't want to not do them. You want the school's qualities and what the school has to offer to align with what you want. And you need to convince them that that union between you and your school is going to bring benefit to everyone and it's going to help you fulfill your goals. So a much better example would be, as a potential applied mathematics major, I hope to gain the tools to model political behavior. I'm especially interested in elections and I'm looking forward to taking the course Mathematics of Social Choice as the centerpiece of social choice theory is voting. I would also love to take nonlinear dynamics and chaos because it will teach me, you get the idea, right? The student is, in this example, mentioning very specifically, specific courses, specific things that the university has to, or the college in this case, has to offer and showing how they align with their own interests. Now, there is a bit of a point of caution there that you don't really, you want to be careful about what's called name dropping, right? You don't want to make it sound like you just quickly looked up a course or some professors, name drop them just to make it look like you did your research and just not do anything with it. But in general, being more specific is much better, especially if you can align it with your own goals. So how you would write a why us essay. And this is actually the reason I'm spending a fair bit of time on it is because it's actually quite important. You, in interviews even, you will be asked to defend your choice for why you chose to apply to the university. That's not always the case, but it is the case for a lot of institutions. So the structure that you sort of want, and this is the recommended template, you can change it as you see fit, of course, is you want to introduce your main goals and then the why behind them, which is a great spot for an anecdote. And you can also connect it and ask them to keep in mind your personal application, right? Again, that's why, going back to this, that's why the personal essay is so important. It's because it lets the colleges know of your values, goals, and what you want to do. And sort of your entire profile hinges on that. So, and then you'll mention your first goal, how the school can support it, your second goal, how the school can support it, so on and so forth. This varies a lot depending on how much, first off, how many words they give you, but second, on the school itself. So that is most of the writing supplement. The specific types of writing supplements, other than the YS essay, are a little bit too varied for me to cover with any sort of specificity in a way that's, I think, might be helpful. Just keep in mind that a lot of them are what they are. They are supplemental. You don't need to take them quite as seriously as the personal essay, though do definitely do your absolute best, be eloquent, write well, and make sure bonus points, massive bonus points, if you can get your personal values or goals to be reflected in what you write. Now, another component, which is often overlooked, is letters of recommendation. So when you are applying to US institutions, you will generally need at least 2 letters of recommendation. So they generally want, admissions officers generally want to see letters of recommendation from high school teachers and counselors. But some colleges have more specific requirements. For example, the University of Chicago requires 2 letters of recommendation from teachers in academic subjects, which include mathematics, social studies, so on and so forth, and the school advisor or other types of subjects such as reading, writing, or class discussion. So they want, again, the recurring theme is that schools want to know as much about you as possible and what kind of a student you are, where your interests lie, right? So often what that will be is you can generally choose one of your letters of recommendation from perhaps a teacher that knows you quite well. You want to choose a recommender in general, by the way, that knows you quite well, that you can ask in a timely manner, and with the correct etiquette, of course, and also one that you know will put in a good word for you. Maybe it's one of the classes that you are especially enthusiastic about, right? And also you can include letters from elective teachers or even people outside of school in your extracurriculars, which is, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But you should aim to have at least one academic recommender. And now, usually a college's website will spell out the exact requirements, so you can look that up more specifically. But again, just to sum up, approach instructors with whom you have the best relationships. Typically, that's someone who knows both your personal and academic strengths, right? And do it early. Now, usually US institutions are looking for letters of recommendation from people who are roughly in the 11th, so year 11 or 11th grade, as it is called in the US. And 2 is usually going to be enough. And by the way, these letters of recommendation are usually going to be sent directly through the Common App. You won't get to see them. In fact, it is general policy that they have to be confidential. So you'll never get to see the letter. It's just solely between your teacher and the school. And this is to prevent influence. And of course, be very, very polite and respectful when doing it, just to, well, just because it's the correct thing to do, but also because it generally yields better letters as well. Now, you want them to be enthusiastic about you. And another important thing to consider, and this goes back again to the idea of building a profile, is that you want to choose people who will vouch for qualities that you want to emphasize. For example, maybe let's say you're going into mathematics, then obviously a glowing letter of recommendation from your maths teacher would be a very, very big plus, right? A letter of recommendation from your, let's say, maybe you work part-time in a cafe and it's the manager, and you got a letter of recommendation from the cafe manager. Now that could be good and unique, but if all that the manager is going to say is, oh, this dude was a very good worker, then that's not going to add as much value. So choose your recommenders very well as well, because that is a pretty significant part of your profile. It's not quite as big as the other components that we've been discussing, however. So now we zoom out a bit and we go back to this holistic assessment. So what we've talked about so far is academics and our Common App and our essays, right? And now we're going to talk about maybe the most foreign of these, which is extracurriculars, which goes into, again, this idea of holistic assessment. So what are extracurriculars? Well, it's sort of in the name, right? Now, and why should I care about them? Now, extracurriculars account for around 30%, most people say, of a college application. But the impact on your admissions chances is a little bit more nuanced than that. Now, because a lot of people sort of ask, well, okay, but a lot of these more selective institutions are receiving something like some tens of thousands of applications each year. How are they going to read all of these profiles, read all of the essays, and take a close look at them? The answer is, of course, they don't. What they actually do is they will filter you out. First, they'll have initial screenings based on your marks, your numbers, right? Things that you can read quickly. And maybe if your essays are very obviously poorly written or you have no extracurriculars whatsoever, you might be quickly eliminated. Then the more soft nature of the more getting to know you part is done later when you've passed the initial screenings. Now, extracurriculars are a huge chance for you to actually differentiate yourself from the sea of highly competitive applications with really good numbers. Now, that includes pretty much anything outside of academics. So even though, for example, music and assessment in music is considered pretty much part of high school in Australia, you can definitely consider that an extracurricular for the United States. You can also consider sports. You can also consider things like maybe you did some individual research or volunteering. and even maybe starting your own business or working part-time, right? Now, this, like essays, is a very soft sort of subject, but if they are well done, they can absolutely make you stand out to a significant degree. Now, there are a couple of tiers of extracurricular activities, and to give you an idea of how these sort of work. So the highest level of extracurricular activities, these are what I would consider absolutely exceptional. Like these are the ones that will go a long way towards building a profile that is very, very, very competitive. These might be, for example, winning a prestigious national award or sitting first chair in sitting a first chair in not just your local, but maybe even your state orchestra, starting a nonprofit that gains a lot of attention, maybe even on a national level. These are examples of tier one activities. Obviously, the vast majority of us won't necessarily be able to do something like that. Tier two is extracurricular activities are somewhat more common, but they still demonstrate exceptional achievements. So, for example, you might serve as the student body president or some sort of leader for your school, even, especially if your school is highly competitive in general. If you can make a leadership position in a competitive environment, that is definitely a strong extracurricular. Now, if you will do sports, I recommend that you do something that you did competitively, or maybe you did it as part of your profile. For example, for part of my profile, I chose to include my participation in martial arts, Korean martial arts, and my position as an instructor for disadvantaged children specifically. I was serving for quite a long time in a disadvantaged place where we served a lot of economically disadvantaged people and coached their children specifically in martial arts. And however, I didn't include the fact that I enjoy tennis necessarily, right? More is not always better with extracurriculars. If you do choose to include extracurriculars, now you can include a lot of them, actually. That is sort of up to your individual judgment. And there's some debate as whether to including as well, more or less is better. But so there is some sort of debate on that. But in general, I would say if it doesn't add massively to your profile and it's not particularly impressive, you don't really don't feel compelled to include it. Now, for example, and this is the lowest tier sort of extracurricular that I'm talking about. For example, membership in a club, volunteering regularly at something that maybe a lot of people do, or taking music classes or other types of lessons for several years. Now, these are still much, much better than nothing, and they definitely can still be used to build a very compelling profile, but you need to be careful about how you incorporate them. In other words, to use extracurriculars effectively, you need to aim to build a profile of, first off, of focus, secondly, of competence, excuse me. So contrary to popular belief, this idea of being well-rounded doesn't necessarily make you stand out in college admissions officers. It's quite a pervasive myth, in fact, that you need to be well-rounded to get into a good college. That's not the case. The HSC well-rounded, the all-rounder, I think that's what you call it. I'm blanking on the exact name. Maybe one of you can correct me later. But that sort of award isn't necessarily what a lot of admissions colleges are looking for. In fact, students are more likely to stand out with a very highly developed thing that they specialize in. This is colloquially known as a spike. The idea is if you have sort of a circle of your skills, then you have a sort of a spike sticking out where you've highly developed a skill. So aim to build a profile that has depth instead of breadth. And this can showcase especially your commitment and your specific passion and the fact that you have a heart for a specific issue and that you can contribute uniquely to the college community that you end up attending. Now, to give you some examples of extracurriculars here. Now, remember, colleges are interested in how you've demonstrated leadership, initiative, and growth through your extracurricular activities. So the more you've taken on responsibility or achieved a high level of expertise in a certain area, the more impressive the activity will be to admissions officers. But we have some examples of what you might be able to do as an extracurricular here. STEM extracurriculars in particular, I think are, well, they're the ones that I'm most familiar with personally, just because I'm in STEM. So that might be personal research that you did independently, science Olympiads, hackathons, or hackathons if you're into programming, or STEM clubs. Volunteering, you might have organizations like Amnesty International. Even tutoring, by the way, is actually, because it's not quite common in the United States for students to do tutoring, I do recommend considering maybe including that in your application if your profile is so inclined in that direction. And of course, you can also maybe include volunteering in a clinic or running health fairs. Now, for the arts and for sport, generally, again, if you want to make a meaningful impression, I recommend that you include something that you did competitively. And of course, there's a lot of flexibility in things as well. Like maybe you started a business, Model UN. Debating is definitely a large one, and it's not quite as widespread in the US, so that might actually stand out. Volunteering for a political campaign or running a business, as I've said before, right? One of my major extracurricular, besides the large amount of volunteering work that I did via travel, was that during COVID, I actually wrote a relatively low level, but still published research on COVID-19. So that is just an example of what you can do. Now, because the culture of extracurriculars isn't quite as developed, and for some of you, it might still be a very unfamiliar concept. Now, and remember that admissions officers will actually take that into account, especially for international students, because they understand that the way that high school is structured generally isn't that conducive to intense protracted activity outside of your academics, because the focus in a lot of countries, especially Asian countries, tends to be academics. They do say that they try to account for that. But all the same, always be on the lookout for things that maybe you can add to your profile. It's sort of like a CV, but for academics as well. And of course, you can use this. And the most important part, of course, again, is that you weave this sort of into your own profile, the wider story of who you are and what is the path that you're actually going along to find. For example, maybe you discovered your perfect major, or maybe you discovered what you want to do through an extracurricular. For example, maybe you loved participating in drama club or maybe acting, and you decided that you loved it so much that you decided to pursue that interest in college. Absolutely, that is a brilliant extracurricular that you can incorporate. And you can expand on that, and definitely if you write about it as well, that would be good as well. And if you're wondering, in the common application, when you go to add in your extracurriculars, there's always a text section for you there's usually sort of a section where you can describe specifically what you actually did. And even potentially on some supplemental essays, for example, I think Johns Hopkins and I think Yale, though definitely don't cite me on that, my memory, that was quite a while ago. But they will actually ask you to elaborate on an extracurricular that you did. What did you do outside of school that was particularly impactful to you? And what did you learn from it? So they also want to hear about that as well. And you'll be given the opportunity to explain it. Now, all of this comes together to lead into this wider concept, and this is the concept of fit. So you see, while you're sort of choosing which colleges to apply to, colleges are also choosing which applicants to accept. And there are a lot of factors that get weighed into decisions. And one of them that isn't quite as widely recognized is how well you fit the school's mission and its overall values. Now, there's a lot of variation between the types of institutions. That's also something you want to consider. But there's even more variation within these types of institutions. Now, sort of when you look at them as an outsider, they tend to meld together. They sort of all feel like they're the same thing. They're really not. And it's important for you to understand the nuance and the differences between them. Because now, when you are applying, you want to demonstrate passion and fit. So in other words, you want to align interest with the university and its programs so that colleges get what they want and you get what you want. So remember that schools just aren't looking for top students. That's really not what they're looking for, especially with the more selective institutions, because they're so small and because they're so selective. It's really important to them that they choose the right kind of student or what they feel is the right kind of student. They're looking for students individually and trying to find ones that will fit their specific mission, excuse me, and contribute positively to their community as a wider whole. So a lot of this information you can get sort of by looking at the school's numbers, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also the school's website, even at the most basic level, right? And in addition, definitely pay attention to the concept of student life. Now, the reason that I'm emphasizing fit so much is, and we can sort of see, looking back, why I've emphasized it is because you will have to write about why this, right? You'll have to write a why us essay. You will be asked almost definitely if you get to the interviews, if there is an interview, though not all colleges do interviews, by the way, you will be asked to defend your choice of that college. And in general, more conceptually and more abstractly, you want to convince the college that what you want to do is aligned with what the college can actually provide you and that it will be a mutually beneficial relationship. So let's take a quick little example of what that might actually look like. So let's take Columbia. Now, if you visit Columbia's website right now, right away, you'll see that the site is presented in a very sort of modern, simple, minimalistic, and well, not quite minimalistic, but a very professional way. There's no graphic design, there's no overt graphic design elements. It's very monocolored, and the website looks fairly traditional, right? Now, if you do some exploring of the website, you'll find that a lot of life at Columbia is centered around the core curriculum and around the fact that it is situated in metropolitan New York, right? And its connections to the outside world. And it has this very strong emphasis on excellent academics and a very high level of professionalism. So Columbia University, just by looking at the website, you can sort of tell already it is very, very academically focused. In fact, you can even take a look over here and you will have all of these news of alumni and academic achievements recently, and their mission statement here as well, which you can read and you can confirm for yourself, right? Now, in slight contrast to that, so this is not in any way, by the way, to malign any of these institutions. It's just that they have these certain tendencies, and it's important for you to orient yourself if you want to attend this institution. Let's say you want to attend Columbia. It's really important that you align yourself in a way such that they think that, well, in other words, that you're a good fit for that place, right? Now, on the other hand, let's maybe take a look at Cornell. Now, at first glance, Cornell also appears fairly traditional, quite similar. In fact, at the higher level, a lot of these institutions, they have very similar looking websites. But if you do a little bit of digging, first off, its focus seems more diverse or multidisciplinary. The headlines aren't quite as dominated about academics as Cornell was, right? And first, we also see, this is the homepage here. We're greeted with the news about New York's first dairy farm, Biochar Flynn, which advances green agriculture. This is sort of a reflection of the more rural nature of Cornell. In fact, one of the great things or worst things, if you don't like that sort of thing, it depends on who you ask, about Cornell, is that it is relatively rural compared to Columbia, which is an extremely urban university. Cornell is quite rural, and it's sort of natural that it might be focused more on biology, and agriculture in general. Though, like all of the Ivies, it is extremely well-rounded academically, and it will excel in pretty much every area. Now, however, you will also notice that Cornell has an entire separate section for athletics. It's and they even have a hashtag Yell Cornell. So student athletics is a very, very large part of Cornell University. And there is a separate even site for campus and community engagement with a searchable database of over 1,000 student groups, including a lot of fraternities and sororities. So Cornell, in general, you can tell from this, has a heavier focus on sports and Greek life than, say, you'll find in Columbia. So to fit well at Cornell, you might be involved with athletics or interested in so-called Greek life or these fraternities and sororities. And in regards to Greek life in general, yes, they do get rather a sour reputation, especially with reports of hazing and things of that nature. But in general, they are just sort of a present part of university life. And a lot of people do absolutely love them as ways to meet a lot of people and forge very long-lasting connections in university. So Cornell has a bit more of a traditional experience also, as you can see here. So if this sort of thing appeals to you, then Cornell is the right place for you. And this was a very abstracted overall view. There are a lot of things that are more specific that you might like. For example, Brown University has a flexible core. In fact, it has practically almost no core curriculum. You construct your own degree, which is very unique. And if that is what appeals to you, you can absolutely write about that when they ask you, why did you apply to Brown? So definitely take a look at the specific characteristics of a university and assess how well you fit. So that's the conceptual one. There's also the numbers. Now, there's a lot of metrics by which to compare universities and assess how well you fit with that university. The biggest one is student to faculty ratio, which a lot of you might be already familiar with, which is the ratio basically of students to staff. And the more students you have per staff, the worse generally that it is seen. Now, places like private institutions generally have quite low of a student to faculty ratio. The places that have the lowest student to faculty ratio are generally liberal arts colleges, as I mentioned before. So that's one metric to consider. The other is international percentage. It's the percentage of international students that you have in that institution, because that might give you a little bit of a hint as to how friendly these schools are or how appealing they are to other international students. And also demographics is also one that I encourage you to look into as well. If the school that you're applying to has a very large international student percentage, there's a pretty big chance that you'll feel a lot more at home because that might be part of the university's culture. I pretty much didn't bother, even though I did get my education in the United States, I didn't really bother applying to any schools that had a very low international student percentage or seemed very monocultural in terms of their demographic, just because it wasn't the sort of environment that appealed to me. Another thing to consider is scholarships. So I want to backtrack just a little and want to talk about scholarships in terms of these systems. And I did touch on this briefly, I believe, in the sort of the introduction to the US admissions landscape, but I want to emphasize it again. So private universities or colleges will be able to offer what is called financial aid. Now, this is different from a loan. So it's not anything like, because the United States does have something very similar to your HECS loan, which is just a loan that the government can give to students to help them pay off their uni fees. If you're not an American student, of course, you won't be able to get that. But private institutions, because they have a lot of money, and I mean a lot, they often will be able to give direct financial aid to economically disadvantaged students. If you can show that you will have trouble affording to attend this university, then often you can apply for financial aid, and the university will pay and help cover the gap between your ability to provide and what you need to pay for the university. Now, just one moment. Excuse me. So, liberal arts colleges also offer this sort of option. It's often just a little box that you tick, and then later you provide a lot of documentation when you're actually making the application. Now, this can range from anything from a complete full ride. Some of the people that I know got full rides, especially if you are very competitive, a very competitive application. This is much more likely to happen. However, this may sometimes actually harm your chances. Now, this again is a little bit unfortunate, but it comes from the fact that a lot of these institutions are businesses and they want students, ideally, usually, if they can help it, that will actually be paying for their degrees. So a lot of institutions actually will view your application ever so slightly less favorably if you have indicated that you want financial need, you need financial aid. Now, that is another part of this, which is available scholarships and available financial aid. The good news is that a lot of the Ivies, practically all of the highly selective, the top 20, or even up to the top 50 in the United States, including non-Ivies that are still very good colleges, will usually offer some form of financial aid just because they have a lot of applicants coming in internationally in general, and they want to serve disadvantaged students as well economically. And a fair subset of them are what is called need blind. So need blind colleges don't care about whether you've selected that you want financial aid or not. So they won't factor that into admissions, and they'll just deal with it once they admit you. Need blind institutions include Brown University and College and Harvard College as well as a litany of other institutions. So you also want to consider that, and you also want to consider general acceptance rate, just to match to your own academic ability and your ambition. So you can use College Find is a resource that I quite strongly recommend for admissions information and in general, but more specifically about information about colleges. You can search for colleges and you can view a lot of their metrics. Times Higher Education World University Rankings, which is quite a mouthful, is another very useful website that does something similar. And you can even search for universities and build a list within Common App. But what I personally used during my application cycle was College Find. Now, this is an example of all of the metrics that you will be provided to you. And it looks like a lot, but it's really not too much once you just get used to viewing it. You have first-year student numbers enrolled, you have admission policy, you have the diversity of your students, which is something that they do actually care about a lot in the United States. You have your international percentage, your student to faculty ratio, and your overall applicants and acceptance rate over here. So that now all of these are things that you will want to take into consideration when constructing your application. So as a bit of a recap, we have here just a practical schedule of what you will need and your timeline. Now, a brief note that the academic year in the United States starts with what is fall in the United States, which is September and December. Now, your first stage, again, 1 year before you end up applying, and that would be in June, July, is you start researching and gathering your resources. Stage 2 is you sit your exams. Specifically for you, that would mean your SAT. For the SAT, by the way, it's usually available quite internationally and is available periodically throughout most of the year. There is, if I recall correctly, a June SAT, there's a September SAT, there's even a January SAT. So there is a lot of opportunities for you to take the SAT exam, and you can actually take it multiple times. So if you take it too many times, then your scores tend to be viewed a little bit more unfavorably, but that up to around 3 times, you definitely can feel free to retest. So you'll sit your exams 9 months before applying. So that's from August to October. your third stage, which is you would start drafting your essays, because trust me, it takes a fair bit more time, especially if you are as slow of a writer as I am. You want to do that well before you start actually applying. And you want to start arranging for your letters of recommendation. Make sure that your teachers have plenty of alert time well before. And your stage 4 is you'll actually want to write your essays. So that is around 6 to 5 months before applying. If you weren't happy or you think that you could do better with your exams, retest and start researching scholarships as well, around 4 to 3 months before applying. And you can pretty much complete it. And that's pretty much it. So a couple of key deadlines are over here. So November is your early application and early decision deadline, which we're going to talk about in the miscellaneous section later. And in January, this is the deadline for regular applications. And in March to April, your results will be released. So the results of your applications. And on the 1st of May, you will need to give a decision to every place that did send you an offer. So some additional general tips and information. Of course, this is just something to keep in mind. This one's really obvious and a big shock. Plan early. Applying early has advantages as well. So there's this concept called early application when you're applying to places in the United States. So early application is you send an application in a separate schedule that to just one place. You can only do it to one place much earlier than normal. And this has a couple of advantages. First off, that gets because the place that you'll be applying early to is the one that you will be wanting the most. First off, it gets that out of the way for you. Second, it shows your commitment to that institution. The main reason for that is that early applications are binding. In other words, if you get accepted to the place that you applied early to, you will have to attend contractually. You have to attend to the place that you applied early to. So the place that you apply early to will be the one that you want to attend the most, usually. And so that shows, first off, commitment. Second, early applications generally have a higher rate of admission, just because your application isn't quite as saturated in the sea of other applications, because as you can imagine, your admissions officers get your application much earlier and they can see it in a much smaller pool. And so definitely consider early applications to certain places if you really hone in on a school and you think, oh, I really want to do everything I can to attend it, right? Now, fit, we've also sort of already covered. And just to reiterate, extracurriculars outside of grades make a huge difference. They can be what makes your application actually stand out. And you want to do it, again, in a way that sort of builds your profile. So choose your extracurriculars that you want to include carefully. And if you still have the power to do so, definitely choose ones that you think will further what you want to do. Now, the fourth point, which is that Australian grades are generally, they will be well accepted by US admissions. So that is not quite something to worry about, that you need to worry about. Just make sure to clarify, explain yourself, even potentially include something of a GPA, which is the American high school system for marking high school, sort of a GPA equivalent. Another tip is that, because a lot of students sort of worry, okay, but what if I'm not quite sure of what I want to major in university? Or what if I'm not quite sure of what I want to do? That's completely fine, actually. In most applications, even to the most selective ones, there is an option to simply not indicate or tell them you're still considering what to choose in terms of majors. So being undecided in your major is completely fine. Now, caveat is that you still want a compelling profile and a general academic direction. Not having a major, no problem. Not having direction, goals, or values, that's a problem. You want those at the very least, right? And gap years are definitely a possibility, as are enrolling in Australian university first and dropping out. I added that last one in sort of just as example because one of my friends did it and there were no problems, though the admin work was a little bit on the shaky side. But it is possible for schedules and admission cycles to coincide, overlap even, and for things to still work out. And gap years, of course, you can even indicate when you apply which year you want to attend. Do you want to attend immediately, or if you're accepted, do you want to attend the next year? And do you want to take a gap year in the center, in the middle? So that is also a possibility. Now, some FAQs here, and I sort of covered most of these already. And I do realize I even covered retesting with the SAT. One that I might clarify on a little bit is regarding the question of whether acceptance is conditional. In short, no. In the United States higher education system, if you get in, you get in. There's no conditions. Though that doesn't mean that you can maybe get accepted and then completely fall off in year 12. They actually do require you to send through a transcript of your completed HSC results for Australians, at least. It would be the HSC. And if you have a tremendous drop off in your grades, they might actually cancel your application. That has happened to people. That you do get cases like that. But in general, if you do get in, you get in. So one final summary of this slide that I keep going back to. Now, build a compelling profile. Being an all-rounder is great. Excelling at a lot of different things is brilliant. In fact, when I was applying myself, because I had strong interest in both writing and in medicine, I sort of had this narrative of how interdisciplinary thinking can be beneficial to either doing writing or even to doing medicine. I had that sort of an idea going. That is definitely possible, but at the same time, definitely go more for depth rather than breadth. And you want to build a profile of focus, consistency, and alignment of your general values with the place that you end up applying to. And just to wrap up here, we have some key resources as well. If you want to prepare for the SAT, I once again strongly recommend books by Erica Meltzer and Nielsen Fu's College Panda. This is both a book series and a website. The book specifically I recommend if you just want a quick overview of SAT mathematics. Though again, SAT mathematics is accessible enough that for the mathematically inclined of you, I strongly recommend simply using Khan Academy. And take a couple of practice tests if you are interested, because that's free. Khan Academy is completely free. It's open access. It'll take you just 2 hours. Try taking the SAT on Khan Academy, and who knows, you might be pleasantly surprised at how well you do. For general admissions information, search for Prep Scholar guides and blogs that I personally found was quite helpful, as well as College Fine. And if you want a better grasp on essays, because that's always the biggest point that students tend to struggle with, I strongly, strongly recommend reading through essays that worked pages for respective institutions. A lot of schools actually upload their own essays that got students accepted. Take a read at them, and with a caveat that they're not always going to be the best essays that you could write. In fact, some of them might even be considered slightly subpar. The point is that they worked, and there's specific reasons that they worked. So definitely take a look at those. And of course, another big resource is your school advisors, who will, I'm absolutely sure, be delighted to help you. It helps if your school has good advisors, of course, that care. But definitely take use of all of the resources that are available to you. And with that, that is more or less all that you'll need for a very general overview of your guide to US university admissions. So now I think we might have some time for some questions if people have any. But that is the core of this seminar completed. So thank you all for coming and listening so far.
Hi, thank you for talking. I have a question about the essays. So
Yeah.
I found online that some colleges require a second supplementary essay for additional information. And I was wondering the structure for that. Like, what would you normally talk
Mhm.
about in it? Because it's very open-ended.
Right. Yes. I think the thing that okay, first off, thank you. Very good question. Yi Chen, if I saw who was speaking correctly. Um, I think the thing that students tend to struggle with the most in general when it comes to writing essays is that they're so open-ended. Uh, the types of structures that you could apply are really quite endless. Some people have chosen even, and they've gotten accepted by writing borderline just completely fictional sort of almost poems. Now, that's absolutely not something I would recommend. But the point is that the structure, somewhat disappointingly, and I know this is a rather disappointing answer, they tend to be more open-ended than especially what you might encounter in Australian HSC English. They are very open-ended and they're really just wanting to get to know you better. I think for secondary essays, I'm trying to think of maybe some examples of what I might have written. So for my Common App essay, I simply wrote about and this is not necessarily the most optimal, though it is definitely doable. I wrote about my experiences growing up and moving around so much and what I saw. For my supplementary essays, I think I chose to wrote somewhat paradoxically about what I regarded as my biggest failure. I think that was a prompt for one of the supplementary essays. And what I learned from it, how that shaped me, my values from it, right? That is a very risky sort of essay topic that you could maybe go for. But and keep in mind of what the school might be trying to get out of you through that supplementary essay, right? But again, it's so very general that it's hard for me to give a specific answer on structure. Even this particular structure here, montage versus narrative, is some might argue is a bit too rigid, and they might actually be opposed to it. But I think it's better to have some sort of structure going into it than not. I think maybe this list of whether your core values come through might be a good starting point. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
If we have any other questions also, and if people would rather type in the chat to ask questions, that's completely fine as well. We'll just have a couple of minutes and I might give my voice just a little bit of a break in the meantime. Zed asks, in which year do you recommend to sit for AP tests? That is a pretty good question. So that depends sort of on what courses you take specifically. I think for the vast majority of people take most of their AP courses in year 11 and year 12. There's a caveat there that AP tests are not widely available in Australia. AP courses are available as supplements that you can take online. For example, there's a very high quality program run by Johns Hopkins University called Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth. That's again a bit of a mouthful. Some of these institutions, they have very long names, but using through that institution, and it's actually the one that I utilized, you can use that to take the course and incorporate that into your end of high school transcript, and that will reflect positively on admissions. Samsung user SM S9118B says, do you need AP courses as you have already done the HSC? In short, no. AP courses are supplementary. They show that you challenged yourself. And the reason that I focused on them was to show that a big emphasis is on you challenging yourself academically, right? In the American context, APs make sense. For Australian students, I think it makes a lot more sense to simply do extension subjects and, if possible, the IB programs, right? And to directly answer the question of which year do you recommend to sit the AP tests, most students sit them in year 11 and year 12, though it is very doable, and especially for, I would say, if you have a strong foundation in the respective subject that you're taking, it is very possible to do them in year 10 as well. Mathematics, and the ones that, especially if you're going into STEM, the ones that I would strongly recommend that you take a look at if you do want to take them would be calculus and chemistry and biology, though people don't like biology in general. So if you're not interested, definitely you don't necessarily have to put yourself through that. But the extension subjects in university, not university, excuse me, in the HSC are definitely very, very worthy substitutes. And I would argue that the level at which you study academically, because I have experience tutoring in the HSC, the level of study reflected in the HSC is equal to or often greater than that you see in AP courses. Maybe you could even, and I do recommend actually doing this, explain that in a supplemental part, or maybe add that as an explanation as you send through your transcript, because that is definitely doable, and people value being able to have those explanations, because to admissions officers in the US, they won't be quite as familiar. When should we start SAT? From year 10? Because the SAT relies on mathematics that you don't really need to study that much for, you can definitely take them in year 10, though most students take them early year 11. So that is the time that I would recommend that you take them, but you can start practicing from as early as year 10 or even earlier, especially if you're a reasonably strong student. There's no hard deadline for you to take the SAT. And in fact, as I mentioned before, some institutions even go test optional, right? But start taking the SAT. You want to have your SAT ideally wrapped up and your results out by the time that you send through your early applications. And in general, and this is true for sort of any academic endeavor that you undertake, the older you get, the better score you'll get usually, because you get better at studying and your abilities increase. No problem, Zed. Hope that answered your question more. Xavier asks, are the degrees that you did in America, are they accepted in Australia? That's a reasonably good question. It depends on your specialty. I think I've been put on the spot here a little bit, actually. I think for medicine, there is some amount of interconvertibility, but that's specifically for medicine. In general, a degree from a high-level institution pretty much anywhere in the world, pretty much anywhere in the world will be accepted again, anywhere in the world. And it is definitely possible to come back to Australia to do postgraduate studies if that is something that interests you. Though the vast majority of people that do end up attending a US institution, simply because they already have the connections there, choose to take employment in the United States. But it's definitely possible to have your degrees accepted back in Australia as well. The difference, especially at the professional level for academics, is not quite as large. Though again, that differs a lot. Zed asks, is it possible to self-study IB subjects? IB subjects, I'm not quite as personally familiar with. I would say that it is definitely possible to study AP subjects, but IB, unfortunately, I'm not quite as familiar with, so I don't think I can help you as much there. But I encourage you to actually take a look for yourself. I am reasonably certain that there are programs so that you can practically self-study the IB. Xavier asks, for medical degrees in America, do you need to do the UMAT or an interview? If you're talking about undergraduate degrees, for medical degrees in America, it's treated the same as most undergraduate, except for certain institutions, for example, Johns Hopkins, because Johns Hopkins has so many students applying for pre-med programs, they have a separate sort of essay that pre-med students need to write. And you would be expected to sit an interview, but other than that, the undergraduate system doesn't look that much different. The postgrad system, where if you want to get accepted to med school proper, which is after you finish your bachelor's degree, that requires an exam called the MCAT, which is similar to the GAMSAT in Australia. Well, conceptually similar, but practically they're quite different. And you would also need interviews. Zed asks, are you familiar with the UC systems? I am reasonably, though I personally don't have as much experience with them as the other systems, just because for specific personal reasons, California wasn't the most attractive choice to me. But UC systems, the principles that I've talked about here so far will still apply entirely. Are there any good medical studies in the UC systems? Absolutely. The UC systems are some of the best universities in the world. You will absolutely find incredibly high level academics there, not least in medicine, but in STEM in general and the humanities. I think I will have just 2 more minutes because we are technically going just a little bit over time for maybe any additional questions, and then we will wrap up. Oh, and just as a general point of reference, there's no separate combined med degree. That's very, very rare. I think Brown, from my knowledge, Brown University and a couple of other select places offer combined degrees where if you're accepted to the undergraduate portion, you're guaranteed entry into the postgrad, similar to what UCID's and UNSW's double degree medical programs have. That does exist, but it's very, very, very rare. Usually you'll just go into what's called pre-med studies, which is usually a major in biomedical engineering or something of that nature. And then you'll need to apply again to postgraduate. Right, okay. Our time is up pretty much. So I think I will wrap it up right here. So once again, thank you all so much for coming and being such attentive listeners. It's been an absolute pleasure to present to all of you here on behalf of Dr. Jin Education. Yep, that's